You really stopped calling? The question came through the phone one evening, trembling somewhere between anger and disbelief. But there was no reply, just quiet. Not the kind of silence that begged for attention, but the kind that settled like peace after a storm. They don't understand it. They call it pride, maybe bitterness. They call it arrogance. But you know what it really is, clarity. That sacred, unshakable kind that comes when God finally opens your eyes and says, "Now you see who they truly were." You once tolerated their chaos, laughed off their guilt trips, forgave the same betrayal wrapped in new excuses. You used to pick up every call, fix every misunderstanding, explain yourself just to keep peace. But one day, the explaining felt heavier than the silence. And when you prayed for peace, God answered by taking your voice away, not because you had nothing left to say, but because the words no longer served your growth. That's the thing about divine direction. It rarely makes sense in the moment. You just wake up one morning and realize your heart feels lighter when you don't reach out. You don't feel anger. You don't feel hate. You just feel done. And that's when heaven whispers. That's not indifference. That's healing. They're mad because they can't control you anymore. They used to pull your emotions like puppet strings. One text, one guilt trip, one reminder of everything you owe them. But now your silence screams louder than your apologies ever could. They miss your presence because your presence covered their darkness. And when light leaves, shadows panic. God saw how much you gave. He saw you loving people who only loved what you gave them. He saw your loyalty turned into leverage. And when you cried about why they kept hurting you, He didn't send an answer. He sent distance. Distance that looked like loneliness at first, but was really protection in disguise. Because when God separates, He doesn't always announce it. He just closes doors you were too tired to shut. He just drains your desire to chase people who never chased you. You start feeling peace where confusion used to live. You start laughing without checking who's watching. You start breathing again. And they hate that. They'll say you changed. They'll say you're cold. But really, you're just calm. You've stopped confusing chaos for love. You've stopped mistaking tolerance for kindness. You've stopped apologizing for boundaries. What they call distance, heaven calls deliverance. You used to feel guilty for not explaining your side. Now you understand that real peace doesn't need justification. You don't argue with people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You don't beg for closure from doors God already locked. You just walk away, quietly, gracefully, faithfully. And in that quiet, God starts talking. He shows you who's real and who's just comfortable, who celebrated you and who only tolerated you, who prayed for you and who prayed on you. That's the revelation that silence brings. The truth you couldn't see when you were busy trying to fix what God already broke apart. So no, you're not cruel. You're not bitter. You're not heartless. You're healed. You're obedient. You're aligned. You've learned that not every connection deserves continuation, and not every chapter deserves a sequel. Some people were lessons dressed as loyalty. Others were assignments that expired. God just made sure you didn't miss the deadline. Let them be angry. Let them call you distant. Let them misinterpret your peace. Because while they're talking about how quiet you've become, God is working on everything they'll soon see. He's building your life in such a way that your silence will turn into testimony. One day, they'll realize that your absence wasn't punishment. It was prophecy. God had to remove you to reveal you. And when He finally elevates you, those who misunderstood your quiet will witness the proof that you were never running away. You were being refined. So keep your peace. Keep your distance. Keep walking forward with God's voice as your compass. You don't owe anyone a call back. Not when heaven already called you higher. Don't call them. That small, quiet voice said in his chest, soft but sure. It wasn't anger holding his hand still. It was peace. That kind of peace that hums louder than any apology ever could. He had spent too many nights defending what God already delivered him from, explaining himself to people who didn't really want to understand. Now, silence was his obedience. It was his way of saying, God, I trust you more than I trust how I feel. At first, the stillness felt strange. His phone stopped lighting up with familiar names, and his evenings grew quieter. He'd reach for the phone out of habit, thumb hovering over old messages, only to feel that same tug in his heart, don't call. So he didn't. Not because he stopped caring, but because he finally realized that peace costs something. Every unmade call became a seed of faith planted in silence. Every unanswered text became a small act of trust that God was doing something better behind the scenes. They didn't see it that way, of course. They said he'd changed. They said he was distant now, that he thought he was too good. They didn't understand that growth looks like distance when you're still stuck in dysfunction. They mistook his boundaries for betrayal, his peace for pride. But what they called arrogance was actually alignment. What they called silence was actually strength. He used to crave explanations. He wanted people to get it, to know that his heart was still kind, just tired. But one morning, sitting with his coffee as sunlight poured through the blinds, he finally understood. He didn't need anyone to get it. God did. That was enough. The peace he'd been begging for wasn't hidden in more conversations. It was hiding in quiet obedience. When he stopped calling, it wasn't rebellion. It was revelation. He realized that not everyone was meant to stay. Some people were assignments, not attachments. Some were there to teach him patience, self-respect, or the art of letting go. But he tried to make classrooms into homes, lessons into lifelong commitments. God had to intervene. They were mad because his silence forced them to see what his forgiveness used to cover. When he stopped calling, they couldn't hide behind his apologies anymore. They had to sit in their own noise, face their own actions, feel the absence of the person who always reached out first. And that was the real reason for their anger. His peace revealed their chaos. He used to think being quiet meant being weak. America teaches you to fight back, to speak up, to prove your point. But now he saw it differently. True strength wasn't in shouting the truth, it was in living it. Every time he chose silence over argument, patience over pride, prayer over panic, heaven noticed. God doesn't need noise to move. He just needs obedience. In that stillness, God started rebuilding him. He began to see the difference between people who truly cared and people who just needed him to fill their emptiness. Some relationships were built on dependency, not love. They liked him better when he was uncertain, when his boundaries were blurry. But when he found his confidence in God, they called him changed. They were right. He was. Each quiet evening became a classroom of peace. God taught him that forgiveness doesn't mean foolishness, that love doesn't require losing yourself, that walking away isn't cruel when it's commanded, and that sometimes the holiest thing you can do is say nothing at all. People will always have their version of the story. They'll twist your silence into offense, your distance into arrogance. But the truth doesn't need defending. It just needs time. And time, under God's hand, always reveals what words could not. He began noticing how much lighter life felt without the constant need to explain. He no longer felt the pressure to keep people who were only comfortable with his brokenness. God was teaching him the discipline of peace, to stay quiet when he wanted to prove, to stay kind when he wanted to cut deep, to stay calm when chaos invited him to dance. That's what real maturity looks like, restraint powered by faith. He learned that being alone with God isn't loneliness. It's healing. It's sacred rebuilding. God started whispering things to him he never could have heard in the noise. Promises, clarity, direction. The same silence others called cold was actually his preparation. God was clearing out what cluttered his spirit so he could hear divine instruction. Some nights, he'd still feel that tug of guilt, the voice that said, "You should have called." But then he'd remember how often he'd called before, how often he'd reached out and got nothing back but confusion. No more. Now he understood that every no to chaos was a yes to peace. Every distance was divine design. They were mad because they couldn't manipulate him anymore. His calmness frustrated them because it exposed their control. When he stopped feeding their need for drama, their appetite for attention went hungry. But that wasn't his problem anymore. That was their lesson to learn. And in that freedom, he finally saw the beauty of being misunderstood. You don't have to clear your name when heaven already knows your heart. You don't have to defend yourself when God is your defender. The same people who mock your stillness today will one day witness your peace and realize it was never personal. It was spiritual. He smiled more now, quietly, peacefully. He didn't chase validation anymore. He didn't check who texted back. He just trusted that whoever was meant to be part of his next chapter would find him in God's timing. His silence wasn't punishment. It was positioning. Because one thing he knew for sure, when God wants to bless you, he often starts by subtracting. And the peace that follows is not fragile, it's fierce. It's guarded by prayer, discipline, and divine protection. So he didn't call. Not because he stopped caring, but because he finally started listening. The silence that once felt heavy now felt holy. He knew that God was writing something new, a life where his peace was protected, his purpose clear, and his soul no longer tied to people who couldn't handle his healing. Let them be mad. Let them misunderstand. One day they'll see that his silence wasn't rejection, it was redirection. It wasn't pride, it was purpose. And when they do, they'll realize what he already knew. Sometimes, the loudest act of faith is to stay quiet. Sometimes, not calling back is how you finally answer God's call forward.